Okay, so you want to own an Egyptian temple. Carve the columns, paint the walls in gold and blue, fill the halls with incense smoke, and spend the rest of your life as the living intermediary between mortals and gods while grain and gold pour in from grateful worshippers. Simple enough. Here is the problem. That picture, the temple as a spiritual vending machine printing devotion into wealth, is almost completely wrong. A major Egyptian temple was not a shrine that happened to collect donations. It was one of the largest, most complex economic institutions in the ancient world. So let's talk about what it actually cost to own an Egyptian temple. Not the myth, the ledger.
Before we talk about stone and gold leaf, understand the same rule that applied to castles applies here, just at a much larger scale. A temple with no land attached to it was a beautiful, empty shell. It produced nothing. It fed no one. It employed no one. The wealth of a major Egyptian temple came from what the state granted it in land and labor. Temples across Egypt held vast estates, farmland worked by tenant farmers, orchards, vineyards, fishing rights on the Nile, and herds of cattle, sheep, and goats. The temple building itself was the administrative center of that estate. Remove the land, the workers, and the herds, and you're left with a very expensive stone box that burns incense for an audience of no one.
We don't have to estimate this one. We have the actual bill. Consider the Temple of Karnak, dedicated to the god Amun at Thebes. Construction and expansion ran continuously for roughly 2,000 years. The Great Hypostyle Hall alone covers over 5,000 square meters and contains 134 massive sandstone columns, the tallest reaching 21 meters high. Quarrying, transporting, carving, and raising columns of that size required tens of thousands of skilled and unskilled laborers working over decades. Obelisks were even more punishing. The single granite obelisk commissioned by Hatshepsut stands nearly 30 meters tall and weighs approximately 320 tons. It was quarried in one piece at Aswan, over 200 kilometers south, and moved down the Nile on a specially built barge before being raised into position. Her own inscriptions boast that the work was completed in 7 months.
Just like transporting castle stone by ox cart, the real killer in Egyptian construction was moving impossibly heavy material across serious distances with no wheeled vehicles suited to the load and no draft animals strong enough to do it alone. Granite for obelisks and colossal statues came almost exclusively from the quarries at Aswan, hundreds of kilometers from most major temple sites. Sandstone for Karnak's own halls came from quarries at Gebel el-Silsila. Moving these blocks required river barges built specifically for the purpose, some capable of carrying loads exceeding 300 tons, plus armies of laborers to drag, lever, and float the stone into position once it arrived. Feeding, housing, and organizing that labor force for a project spanning decades was, just like the medieval castle building sites, effectively running a temporary city that existed purely to move rock. This is where Egyptian temples stop resembling castles and start looking like something closer to a modern conglomerate. The Papyrus Harris I, the longest known papyrus from ancient Egypt, records in detail the donations Ramesses III made to Egypt's major temples over his roughly 31-year reign. According to that document, the temples of Egypt collectively held around 1/3 of all cultivatable land in the entire kingdom by the end of the New Kingdom period. The Temple of Amun at Karnak alone is recorded as controlling roughly 2,300 square kilometers of farmland, 65 villages and towns, 83 ships, and a workforce that some estimates place at over 80,000 people. Running an operation that size required an internal bureaucracy every bit as complex as the royal government itself. You needed a first prophet of Amun, effectively the chief executive of the entire institution. You needed scribes by the hundreds to record grain deliveries, livestock counts, and land leases. You needed lower-ranking priests organized into rotating shifts called phyle. You needed temple singers, musicians, and dancers for festival performances, granary keepers, cattle herders, brewers, bakers, weavers, and boat crews. Here is one that modern people consistently underestimate: the daily offering cycle. Egyptian temple ritual required that the cult statue of the god be ceremonially washed, dressed, and presented with food and drink offerings multiple times every single day, year-round, without exception. This was not symbolic. Real bread, real beer, real meat, and real produce were presented at the altar daily. After the ritual presentation, the offerings were redistributed as payment to the temple staff, a system Egyptologists call reversion of offerings. This meant the temple had to continuously produce or acquire enormous quantities of food as the literal payroll mechanism for tens of thousands of workers. Temple granaries at major sites like Karnak had storage capacity to hold grain reserves large enough to function as regional economic stabilizers during famine years. Add to that the maintenance of the physical structure. Mud brick outer walls eroded in the annual Nile flood season and required constant rebuilding. Painted relief carvings needed pigment renewal as sun and dust wore them down. None of this stopped because a pharaoh died or a war was being fought elsewhere. The god had to be served every day, regardless of what else was happening in the kingdom. Here's the risk that had nothing to do with weather or enemy armies: royal favor. Because temple wealth was granted by the pharaoh and depended on continuous royal donations and tax exemptions, a temple's fortunes could be built up over centuries and then dismantled by a single reign. The most dramatic example in Egyptian history is the reign of Akhenaten, who abandoned Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of exclusive worship of the sun disk Aten. Akhenaten didn't just stop funding the temples of Amun, he actively ordered the god's name and images chiseled out of monuments across the country and redirected the temple's enormous land holdings and revenue toward his new religious establishment at Amarna. The Amun priesthood was financially gutted within a single reign. It took the restoration under Tutankhamun and his successors to reverse the damage and rebuild the temple's revenue base, a process that took decades. The lesson was permanent. An institution that owned a third of the nation's farmland could still be destroyed overnight if it lost the one relationship that legitimized its wealth in the first place. So how did a temple like Karnak actually generate the revenue to support 80,000 people? Land rents formed the base, exactly as with a medieval manor. Tenant farmers on temple land paid a share of every harvest. On top of that came direct royal grants: gold and silver from Nubian mines, foreign tribute following military campaigns, and enormous one-time gifts of livestock, land, and precious materials given by pharaohs seeking the god's favor or celebrating a military victory. Temples also controlled valuable trade infrastructure. Karnak's 83 recorded ships moved grain, goods, and temple produce along the Nile, in the same way a castle controlling a river toll point captured value from every boat that passed. And temples ran their own workshops, weaving linen, brewing beer, producing goods that could be sold or traded. Finally, temples charged for access to the sacred itself. Pilgrims and worshippers made offerings to have prayers heard, festivals conducted, and oracles consulted, a system not unlike the manor court fees a medieval lord collected, except here the fee was framed as devotion rather than tax. The most common path to institutional decline followed a specific and well-documented sequence in Egyptian history. A temple accumulated land and gold across several strong reigns. Its priesthood grew wealthier and more politically powerful, to the point where the high priest of Amun at Thebes held influence that rivaled the pharaoh's own authority in Upper Egypt. That concentration of independent wealth eventually threatened the crown itself. By the 21st dynasty, around 1070 BCE, the high priests of Amun at Thebes had effectively become a parallel ruling power in southern Egypt, separate from the pharaoh who nominally ruled from the north. Egypt fractured into what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, with religious and political authority split between competing centers of power. A temple that had grown too wealthy to control eventually became a rival government in its own right, And the unified kingdom that had funded its rise didn't survive the imbalance.
Here's the honest answer. As a purely economic proposition, a major Egyptian temple was staggeringly expensive to build, more expensive to run every single day for millennia, and entirely dependent on a political relationship that could evaporate in a single royal decree. The daily operating costs never stopped, not for war, not for famine, not for a single day. But within the world that built it, the temple was never meant to be evaluated as an investment. It was the physical anchor of the state religion, the guarantor of cosmic order in Egyptian theology. You could not claim divine legitimacy as a ruler without temples performing the rituals that proved the gods favored you. You could not stabilize the economy during a famine without the grain reserves the temples maintained. The pharaohs who managed this relationship best were not the ones who gave temples the most gold. They were the ones who understood that a temple was a partner to be balanced, not a debt to be ignored.